Welcome to everyone who's here. My name's Anne Feltham. I used to work for Campaign Against Arms Trade until I retired, but I am on the steering committee of Drone Wars UK, and it's in that capacity that I'm chairing this session tonight. It should be a very interesting session because Africa is an often overlooked continent, despite the fact it's home to very many people, and it's also a place in constant conflict, or at least some parts of it are. Far too many of them. What's going to happen tonight is there's going to be the three speakers. They're each going to speak for about 15 minutes, 12, 15 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. If you've got any questions or comment, do put them in the chat as we go along. Also, yes, we're going to aim to finish about 8:15 or so. That's the kind of target time anyway, but we'll see how it goes. So as I say, we've got three speakers. We have Cora Morris, who is the person who actually works for Drone Wars UK, who wrote this report. There's Olatunji Olaigbe, I hope I pronounced that right, who's a freelance journalist in Nigeria, and he's had work published by several organisations of great repute, including Al Jazeera. And then we've got Wim, I really don't know how to pronounce your surname, Wim, who works in the Netherlands for the Dutch peace organisation PAX. They do really great work, but I gather tonight he's actually in Geneva. So welcome to all three of you, and we're going to start with Cora. I think all of them are going to screen share when we get to their actual contribution.
Yes, thanks so much, Anne. I'm just going to sort out my screen share. Give me 1 second. Great. Can you all see that okay? Got nods. Can you see that? Can you hear me? Great. Amazing. Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Anne. As you said, my name's Cora Morris, and I'm a researcher here at Drone Wars. And yes, I was very involved, I will say, in putting this report together. So I thought I'd start off by just talking a little bit about how this report came to be. So as an organisation, around about this time last year, we'd begun to notice an uptick in new reported cases of drone strikes in Africa, with a particular emphasis on Ethiopia in the country's ongoing war. However, a more kind of concerted look at this rapid increase made very clear that Ethiopia's case wasn't isolated, and that several countries across the continent were also seeing a very marked increase in both the rate and the lethality of domestic drone strikes, with civilians as their kind of primary victims. As you can see, cases were spread across Ethiopia, Somalia, Mali, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria as the kind of main sites of this increase. And so these naturally became the focus of our research and eventually our report. It's important to say that that isn't to say that other countries aren't operating similar or identical UAVs in Africa with, comparable consequences. But in the kind of period of more rapid proliferation, as we call it, over the last few years, the frequency of internal strikes in these countries was kind of the most significant of all, and that's why that's what we covered. So what became clear quite quickly was that effectively all of these states or actors within them had cultivated relationships during this kind of period with drone suppliers in Turkey and or in China and or in Iran. And all of these countries, Turkey, China, and Iran, have claimed a kind of new position over the last 10 or 15 years as drone-producing states, who seem to be quite willing to sell and export the technologies that they've developed internally, and often for much less money than these technologies have historically cost. These relationships of kind of export and supply, as these have kind of played out in Africa, haven't always been limited to this kind of export relationship, but have sometimes encompassed wider dynamics of military cooperation. So one important example of this is Turkey's kind of newfound role in Somalia and their cultivation of their first overseas military base there, which is called Camp Turkson. So we can maybe see a kind of wider strategy in the region here for Turkey. And even when these kind of more extensive agreements and arrangements are absent, it looks as though these export relationships are set to continue and set to kind of exist in the long term. So we've got the supplying of more drones and newer models over time. So in Burkina Faso, for example, which received Turkey's Bayraktar TB2 in 2022, new Bayraktar Akinci drones were reportedly delivered in early 2024. So these look to be long-term and presumably quite incentivized relationships. When we look, at charts like this and at the tide of drone proliferation globally, and turn our attention specifically to Africa, we see Nigeria really leading the charge among African states from around about 2015, when they began to be supplied with wing loon drones by China. Though we can see that Algeria and Egypt followed quite soon after. But as we've kind of hinted at, it's in the period from 2021 until now, really, that we've seen the most alarming increase in the number of countries in Africa operating drones. And these have overwhelmingly come from Turkey, and specifically from a manufacturer called Baykar. That includes now all of the countries covered in our report, now that we've had confirmation in the last couple of weeks that forces in Sudan are also operating TB2s. And it's important to say also that all of these states are in one way or another waging internal wars against domestic militant or resistance factions, or ethnic groups, or even whole regions that the government has opted to designate as such. So to kind of zoom in for a moment, an unfortunate zoom in, but a zoom in nonetheless, the question of who are Baykar, who's producing these? And they've kept it in the family. So Baykar at the moment is two brothers. It's Selçuk and Haluk Bayraktar. Their father founded the company in the 80s. And they kind of were responsible for developing the first Turkish UAVs or drones, the Bayraktar Mini UAV and the TB1 across the 2000s, and their third, the Bayraktar TB2, in the years leading up to 2014. And it's really the TB2 that's the focus in these kind of conversations about proliferation, particularly in Africa. And yeah, an unfun fact is that they have very strong ties to the Turkish state. So Selçuk is President Erdogan's son-in-law. But to kind of understand their significance, it's important to understand, what it is about these drones that they're producing that's so appealing, right? And that's really leading this tide of proliferation. So we might think of the TB2 as the kind of jewel in the crown of Baykar's enterprise. It's the vehicle that's really made a global name for the company. It's received quite a lot of attention for its role in the kind of beginning of the war in Ukraine and in kind of offensive missions against Russia. So it's a MALE type drone, which stands for medium altitude, long endurance. These drones can fly for up to 27 hours at a time if necessary. And it's primarily used as a combat vehicle, but it can also be used for reconnaissance and surveillance. It's capable of being remotely operated or flying autonomously, though it's important to say that it's a kind of man-in-loop system. So its targets would always be set by a human operator, even if it's flying autonomously. They're not kind of fully autonomous systems in the ways that we're beginning to see elsewhere. And maybe most crucially, they're thought to cost about $5 million per unit. There's some ambiguity there, but it seems to be around that. By way of comparison, Reaper drones, which are the MALE type drones operated by the US and the UK, are reported to cost about 30 million each. Their capabilities are, of course, somewhat different, but this kind of shows us how significantly more accessible technologies like the TB2 have made drone warfare to states with, significantly smaller military budgets. So with this kind of basic understanding of some of these export and proliferation dynamics and the kinds of weapons we're talking about here, we then started digging into the data. So to write this report, we used overwhelmingly open source resources. We used ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location Event Database, and social media reports and news articles, but making sure to corroborate these through either local media reporting or NGOs with local contacts who had published reports on particular cases. Sometimes this also meant some kind of visual analysis to verify and to geolocate reported incidents. It's important to be clear that while we limited the scope of the report to 50 incidents of major civilian harm, it's very likely that this only scratches the surface. But even from this very, very select sample, we found that at a minimum, more than 943 civilians are likely to have been killed in drone strikes across these countries from November 2021 to November 2024. And again, that's just the strikes that we could cover. From this, very select sample, we see the most incidents by far in Ethiopia, where the premiership of Abiy Ahmed seems to have entailed a particularly kind of mindless approach to launching drone strikes against the TPLF and other resistance groups in the country. We also see a large number of strikes in Mali and Burkina Faso, and increasingly also collaborative efforts with Niger under their new Confederation of Sahel states. We were able to capture some of the reported strikes in the obviously very notable war in Sudan at present, which now seem to be the work of both the RSF and SAF parties, and look to be probably much higher in number than the kind of verifiable incidents in this report suggest. And we also see strikes in Nigeria, as Olatunji will tell us about in a moment, and Somalia, which, while lower in incidents, are both cases with really horrifically large civilian death tolls. But inside these states, we often see quite a different orientation to these incidents, which tends to be in keeping with domestic efforts to control areas thought of as kind of terrorist strongholds as a kind of unifying national mission. So for several of the incidents our report covers, we've seen footage of drone strikes broadcast very, very openly on state TV channels, with incidents that we've verified as having killed civilians, instead celebrated as kind of successful neutralizations of terrorist factions. There's a real sense of accomplishment that seems to be associated with having come into ownership of these ostensibly kind of advanced pieces of military technology. And so in several of these states, we've seen the Bayraktar family be celebrated with state or military medals of honor. I guess that, the obvious question is kind of what underpins this dissonance, right, between these huge civilian tolls and these narratives that are being espoused by these states. Well, implicitly, there seems to be a very broad definition of who constitutes a possible combatant or threat in these contexts. So again, we're often seeing whole regions apparently treated as kind of legitimate targets of this force. It's also really clear that drones massively lower the threshold for the use of force. So conducting large numbers of strikes is seen as less risky when you're not placing your own forces in danger. And so the possibility of a civilian toll is much greater. It's also been clear throughout that the risks posed by, human error or errors of military intelligence is much amplified by the accessibility of drones, which render these errors much more deadly. And these are all dynamics and tactics familiar to those of us who understand the kind of war on terror and what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, this kind of large-scale devaluing of human life in states of kind of military exception, where there apparently exists a kind of ominous and unboundaried threat to neutralize. We see similar dynamics playing out across Africa. So I'm conscious of time, but I will just finish by saying, what next? So Wim will talk to us in a little while about control regimes and the different mechanisms that states and suppliers are subject to when it comes to proliferation. It's obvious that those that exist at present are wildly insufficient, no spoilers, and that for any progress to be made, very large-scale international cooperation is urgently needed. For activists in the UK, we need to actively do what we can to push the UK towards a leading role in these efforts, as difficult as that is after statements and budgets like today's. But there's also, I think, a discursive struggle to understand and expose the kind of reality of these technologies, which, despite their claims to precision and close targeting, are unleashing serious devastation on people's lives. This means really emphasizing the narratives of those who are subject to the kind of everyday terror of drone warfare, because it's these that contest the lies proffered by governments and arms companies. A shift in the kind of popular narrative surrounding drones is a really important first step in any project of non-proliferation. So these technologies stop being seen as desirable and are instead thought of as objects of risk. And that's always been very central to Drone Wars' purpose as an organization. And very finally, we might think about more grassroots forms of resistance, acknowledging fully that this isn't a problem happening somewhere over there, but a global issue that implicates companies and factories that in the UK are on our doorsteps. So supporting that and, contributing to those that seek to obstruct those trade flows materially is also clearly a crucial part of this project. I will stop there, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers and to hearing some of your questions later on. Thanks very much, Anne.
Thank you, Cora. That was a very, very clear introduction. And yes, do put your questions in the chat if you have any questions for afterwards. I think one of the things that really struck me was that graph that showed how a decade or so ago, it was just the major military powers that had access to drones. Now they've really gone, vast numbers of different countries and actors have them. And that presents a completely different problem in many ways that needs to be tackled by all of us. Okay, thanks so much. So over to you, Olatunji. Olatunji's a freelance journalist, as I said, based in Nigeria. His work's been published by Vice, Al Jazeera, Inkstick, and The Record. He reports underlying factors of societal issues, and he was the winner of the International Organization for Migration's 2021 Western Central Africa Migration Journalism Awards. So now, see, your screen is up for us all. Over to you.
Hi everyone. Good evening. It's evening here. As I've been introduced, I'm Olatunji, and of course, I just wanted to take folks through, I think, one of the most coaching experiences that I went through as a journalist last year. So last year, 2023, December 2023, right? We had one of the most clear. So we've had cases of attacks in, where the Air Force, the military mistakes civilians as threat actors, and then, they drop a bomb, but we never actually know that it's a drone. But in this case, they left fragments of the bomb, which I identified, the drone as, I think, a Bayraktar. And it was like one of the clearest indication. Okay, so we've caught you red-handed. This is a drone. This is not a plane. So I did like the sensing with the journalists would do. I was in Lagos, and then I hitched the ride to Kaduna, to go and see sort of the one. When you go into these places, it's at least 1 hour from civilization. Right, the road is crazy. We come down from the bike and then we walk in some places, and I just try to capture, this is a road where the water is, right? This is a road. You can't drive anything particularly heavy on this road, it's going to get stuck. And I remember like arriving to Tudunbiri. Tudunbiri means the Valley of Monkeys. And I remember like arriving to Tudunbiri, I'd been traveling for almost 24 hours. I was super tired. But the moment you enter that village, right, you smell the grief, you stop, because like you forget, and this is a feeling I wish I could put in words. But the moment you get into that village, you see the grief that is caused by people just standing in front of a screen, making decisions miles and miles away in the capital of the city, and just thinking, oh, this is something, we should just drop a bomb there. And when you smell that grief, when you feel that grief, it's indescribable, right? And when people say, oh, 120, and of course the official count of this says, oh, 85 people killed. But from on the ground, and from what I gathered from people, this is over 120 people killed. And to explain how this happens, I need to explain like what happened on that night. People were celebrating. So there's something called the Maulud Nabi. In Nigeria, people are very religious. In northern Nigeria, people, especially Islamic, So they have a celebration called the Maulud Nabi, which is sort of a celebration of the Prophet, Prophet Muhammad birthday. And people celebrate this a lot. So it's a village. People from the surrounding village come to celebrate with them. And they're out there celebrating, and the first bomb drops. And I remember like people telling me, "Oh, I was in the celebration. I went to drink water. I was in the celebration. I went to bring something for my wife." And and you're in the house, you hear the blast, and folks come outside, and just trying to sort through the carnage. A lot of people come around, and this is where it gets really messy. The first blast did not take a lot of people as a second blast, because a lot of people came around and were trying to sort through the rampage and trying to look at, okay, who's worth saving, who's fine. People were trying to help, and then the second bomb drops. And the question is, how easy? I mean, like, if there were humans there, they could tell that, oh, this isn't the situation we think it is, and maybe they would have rethought. And I think that would have been the difference between saying, oh, and I think when Cora showed us the graph, you see like Nigeria has like this big circle that has a lot of casualties, I think more than every other place. And I think that could have been the difference, right? It could have been just maybe 10 people, 15 people. It's a question I spent whole nights trying to answer. Like, it could have been just 10, 15 people, but it's not, right? Because people were trying to help the people who've been hurt, and then another bomb dropped. Like, how low was the threshold that, again, it's really shocking. And when I'm in the village, I hear people saying, oh, like my wife was there, and like, when my son was lucky, because like I had a man whose wife was in the first blast, and then she was dead, and then he unwrapped his son from her back, and then the second bomb dropped. And you're seeing people who lost arms, people who lost legs. And when you get to really rural Nigeria, communities are way tight-knit, different, I think, in a different way from urban spaces, right? A man, people belong to the community. So someone's death is, I mean, for example, someone would die in a community, and like the community might, a whole community has like go to everyone in the community, at least 95% of the community would go to like the person's funeral. And you can imagine the amount of tight-knitness. And so there's this collective spirit of mourning when you're arriving to Dunbury. And I think up until, because I still like keep in touch with some of the folks there, I think up until late last year even, people still mourn, people still remember, because they have the date, right? They think, oh, in this day, a year ago, 2 years ago, we lost this amount of people. And the question I've spent nights asking myself is, what could have been different? Why did this have to happen? And this is not like the first time. It wasn't the first time. I need to understand. It wasn't the first time. It was not the last time. Since that incident, we've had at least 2 more strikes close to celebratory periods, January, December. I think we had one last year, December, and another one in January. 2 more strikes. The guess is, experts are saying, oh, they're probably drones, but like they did not release any concrete information if they were drones or manned flights. But we've had 2 more strikes since then, and it's probably going to happen more. And one of the things that make this really plausible is, as Cora mentioned, we have a lot of infighting in certain parts of in this part of the world. And when these things happen, it's very muddy, because when you get to Tudunbiri, for example, me going to Tudunbiri, I met some of the so-called bandits on the way myself. We don't pass there, there are bandits there. And you pass the bandits going to the village, going to the civilians, you pass the armed militants. It will stop you on the road and say, oh, identify yourself, and I'm doing this, blah, 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 and then you go on your way. But my point is, the bandits, sort of the militants and the communities, exist almost in the same space as each other. So it's very complicated. It's very hard to tell apart who is a bandit and who is a militant. And I think when those kind of things happen, what you need to do, you owe the onus as the one in power
to go on the ground. You owe a responsibility to go on the ground, to step up your intel, to go to the field and ask also what's wrong, or, try to befriend the people, try to understand who is friend and who is foe. I think that part, because of course there is no responsibility because they have drones. There is no responsibility. There is no part of the process where they need to be on the ground. They just look on the screen and call their attacks. Because of that thing on its own has led to an irresponsibility in how intel is managed, in how attacks are deployed, in how all of these things happen, and that's led to like a lot of irresponsibility, a lack of accountability. Because if you have a strike happening last year, and then you have two more happening in the span of a year, of one of the most devastating strike that shook the whole nation, that shows a clear lack of responsibility and a lack of accountability. Why is that happening in a year span to each other? And I think that's because, of course, there are no structures, no regulation in place that keeps people accountable, whether locally, internationally. And of course, like as Cora mentioned, it's not just here, it happens almost everywhere. I was speaking, I think, I've had colleagues who are reporting the same situation in other countries reach out to me. I think also in Cameroon, I think in Niger, say, oh, like this is happening. It's almost casual, and you cannot tell apart. Oh, and as mentioned, as Cora also mentioned, fortunately, is that the narrative is then switched to say, oh, it's threat actors, they're militants, civilians there. But how clean can an attack be? What surgical precision lies in, sending? I mean, when you think of a bomb, it's a very brash way to rather end the conflict. How surgical can that be? How surgical a strike can drop in a bomb on a whole community? How surgical can that be? Because you have to remember that when you term this as collateral damage, that these are people who belong to other people who are species in the community. And I think when you get on the ground, when you go to those communities where these strikes have happened, and you see people mourning their brother, their son, their breadwinner, their grandchild, and you realize, oh, it's not like these are real lives. I cannot, there is no amount of words that will quantify the value of a life. Right, this is a real life. When you say 120 people died, 1, 2, 3, 4, like you can remember the biggest grief that you maybe losing a father, losing your grandparent, how hurtful that is, and then you count that going through that 120 times. Like I try to tell people, like, it's not just, and that's one of the magic of game warfare, as experts call it, is it creates this distance, this illusion that people are just data on the screen, and when you do whatever it is you do, it's like you're just numbers, they're just collateral damage. And yeah, but I think Cora has done more justice to this. I wanted to just sort of show who owns the market. And as you can see sort of here, China leads, is sort of like the market leader. And that's because like it's still the cheapest. So when you look at market metrics, for example, the Barata costs north of 5 million, but like the Chinese equivalent, I think, is just around $1 to $2 million. And so you see, like, also even within sort of, I mean, you can tell that apart from like the US drones, which I've heard goes north of 20, 25 million, but I think you see that within that collapsing market, within that market revolt, sort of competing lower price market, there's still like even worse lower pricing. And so you have like from the expert I spoke with, the attack that happened in Nigeria must have been a Chinese drone. And you see here, since 2020, you see this huge spike in buying. And these are not, again, this goal to make people, this are going somewhere, this are being deployed somewhere. A lot of this attack are not surgical enough, means people get hurt. Like I can count, so we've had 3 attacks, 3 airstrikes where we say, okay, civilians have been hit. Can I count 3 news articles that says, oh, militants have been hit by drone strikes? I probably cannot remember one, but I can remember more than one. And that's crazy if I say, oh, 75% of these attacks are not surgical enough. If I say I'm going to kill someone, but 3 out of 4 times I'm going to kill the wrong person. Like, how in a world with humans are we allowing this to happen? And yeah, I wanted to like, when someone stands miles away, maybe sometimes country away, and they pull these buttons and people die, like real people die, 943 people with families, with sons, with fathers, with mothers, people are dying, right? And I mean, maybe I'm the only person who think about it this way, but people are dying. And again, because I've seen this grief in place. Like, I remember, I see the faces of people who have lost people every now and then. Like when I see what people are dying, like I remember, like I spoke with 12, 15 people who have lost someone. And like that's people who are forever, for the rest of their life, just maimed by the death of someone. And I think like the magic of game warfare, not just in Africa, not just in Nigeria, like across the world, is we've built sort of also from media desensitization, we've built sort of a world where we can hear the death of people, the numbers of people dying, and just not feel anything. And just feel like, man, it's just people, or it's just numbers. It's one of those days, it's just bad news. You turn off the news. But like people, it's the people. Nothing, I don't think there's anything that makes one life much more important than the other. And so when you hear 120 people dying, like that should strike a chord in you. That should make you want to stand up and do something, I think. And so yeah, just to sort of round this off, and this is the mass grave where people were buried. And maybe I shouldn't say this, but so the one in front here contained like most of the men, and this one contained most of the women and children. And so these two graves hold 120 people when you look at it. And while I was in the village, I would have people come from other parts of Nigeria, maybe from the borders of Nigeria, and say, well, my family members are among the people who died. There is no dignity in a mass grave, right? In an unmarked mass grave. And like these people here, these are families of someone in that grave. There's no privacy in this. You don't even get a grave for your person. They have to be ordered with other people. You don't even get a face. You just know they're dead. Some people do not even have a face. They have parts of their body in that grave. And you just understand that like these are not mistakes that some sentient machine made. These are people behind those decisions. And those people, you need to hold those people accountable. Those people need to be brought to book. And this is one of the things, and we need to prevent similar things from happening. So I feel like drones are not making mistakes. People are making mistakes and then burying those mistakes in unmarked graves. And yeah, and that's it. I look forward to your questions, and I'm really looking forward to Wim's session on proliferation and so on. And so yeah, I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olatunji, particularly for bringing in that kind of human dimension. I do think you're pretty amazing to make your way to go and find out more about that strike. I mean, how many miles did you say it was? About 120 over those roads like that?
120 people.
120 people. How long was your road trip? It was quite about the same, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think I was in Edinburgh for I think 2 weeks, just moving around, meeting people, hearing them talk. It's
That was amazing.
again,
That was
I
amazing.
mean,
We rely on people like you to get the information.
but I think when you see the immensity of grief, you can't help it. Like I was supposed to be there for like 4 days. But when you get there, like the best you can do is just listen because people want to talk. Because I think one of the crazy things about this place was the government went there and threatened people not to say anything.
So, you know, we couldn't access. So, for example, the government moved most of the injured. I think that lacked a lot in my place. I couldn't speak with any injured person because they moved the injured people to a government hospital with full security, so we couldn't speak with them. And so, but people wanted to talk. So when you get there, like, of course, like in my story, I have like 3, 4 people, but like I spoke with 15 people. And yeah, I know I wasn't going to cite all 15 people, but the best you could do is just listen and just try to, because again, lives, lives are being lost. And I think people don't think so much about this, but lives, real lives are being lost down there. And I think that's important. So when people say, oh, that was brave, or like, it's not. Because when you get there, you understand why you need to stay.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I hope,
thank you very much.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you for doing that and bringing that story out. Okay, our final speaker is Wim, who's Humanitarian Disarmament Project Leader for the Dutch PAX. His work focuses on emerging military technologies and their impact on how wars are being fought, and the consequences for arms proliferation. Wim's the author of reports, Does Unmanned Make Unacceptable, Armed and Dangerous, and Unmanned Ambitions? So thank you very much for joining us tonight, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Anne. And first of all, thanks for these really insightful presentations for both from Olatunji and from Cora. I think both it's great to see like continued work by groups like Drone Wars, because we all know how much the humanitarian disarmament section has been impacted over the last few years when it comes to doing research on drone work. And also great to see ongoing research in the field that's necessary to document these kind of impacts of strikes on the civilian population. So when I was preparing this presentation, I was linking also to the future. Like I thought, like I'm going to use AI to ask AI, okay, can you imagine drone proliferation for me? And it came up with this image, which sort of is quite a gloomy picture of what drone proliferation means. But today, just to give a background for people, so PAX is a peace organization. We've been working on the use and proliferation of military drones since 2010. And our aim is to continue to monitor and document the increasing use of military drones across the spectrum of wars and armed conflict, and using that kind of research to inform policy making and advocacy on strengthening rules, regulations, and norms around the use and proliferation of drones. And today, based on the presentations from the previous speakers, I'm going to build a little bit on that by looking at, so what are sort of the recent developments that have been also driving discussions around proliferation, and where are we at the moment? So what has been done in the past to address these concerns, and what can we expect for the future? So I think one of the key issues that has driven in the past when we were addressing these drone proliferation impacts was mostly around target killings of drones. And the concerns from those of us who started on working on this in 2010, 2011 was around like US target killings outside of armed conflicts, and the concern that proliferation of these kind of technologies would also increase the application of this, meaning extrajudicial killings without any accountability, transparency, and oversight. Unfortunately, that trend that became a trend, and the reports from the increased use of drones in Africa, this document, but it's not just Africa, but it's also in West Asia, so in Syria, in Iraq, but also looking at Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, those kind of areas. We've seen also increased use of drones for targeted killings and strikes in military operations, and also more potentially in other countries now acquiring armed drones in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, and potentially we haven't seen that so far in this regard in Latin America, but we do see armed groups using drones in Latin America. But that's a different, that's not a different discussion. We'll come back to that later. So what is driving the actually concerns from Western states to start thinking about, because they were for a long time, they didn't want to engage on the discussions, despite various UN reports from special rapporteurs pushing for stricter rules and accountability and controls on proliferation. They didn't really, in particular, NATO-related countries and the US were not very much keen on strengthening this kind of rules and regulations. On the contrary, they were trying to undermine existing arms control agreements when it came to drones. And what changed was like Iran becoming a drone power, building cheap drones, exporting them to proxy groups in both West Asia and to some extent later to states in Eastern Africa, which laid out sort of more concerns over what the implications were for arms control, but also potentially for the market position of the US and its allies. So that made a little bit of change, and also what made some kind of change was concerns over, by the Obama administration, what came afterwards, and what its successor would do, in this case, Trump. What we've been witnessing lately is the increased combination of military drones and commercial drones. So these are two pictures from Gaza. Here you see two Israeli armed military drones flying over Gaza last year, and also commercial drones dropping bombs over Gaza. So the militaries have also increasingly stepped up the use of commercial drones in their operations, which also have implications for markets who've been jumping that bandwagon, and we come back to that later a little bit more. And lastly, and this is an example of an intercepted Chinese military drone in Italy, tipped off by the Americans, which was being shipped to Haftar, the General Haftar, who's in control of the east of Libya, for the Libyan National Armed Forces, who are trying to access military drones, who already received their drones from the UAE, but continues to need them for his operations. So also showing like how important it is to have more export controls on drones before they end up in the wrong hands, in this case, end users who are not authorized to operate those under international agreements. For example, China signed on to the Arms Trade Treaty, which also have very strict assessments on when to export. And in this case, it wouldn't be allowed to export drones to Haftar. And the way we're trying to document these kind of developments is using monitoring conflicts and see what kind of drones are popping up. Because this kind of studies, and in particular, of course, the study done by Drone Wars, looking at civilian casualties from this kind of operations. But in order to understand like who's exporting what, it's really good to monitor like who's exporting where and what. So these are two examples here from the war in Ethiopia. On the left, you see a Wingalung 2 drone, which was based in Sab in Eritrea, which was allegedly used over Ethiopia in support of Ethiopian armed forces against the Tigray forces. So we know the drone was on the airbase. We never could have proved the drone was actually used. There were reports that drones are being used flying from this airbase. According to unofficial sources or anonymous sources that spoke to various international agencies, there were drones being used, but then after criticisms of the Biden administration, the UAE pulled them back. And we only could prove there was a drone on that airbase. We never actually had proof from the ground, like remnants from missiles, etc. They were used, but I don't want to exclude it. Back then, we were a bit more strict, saying, well, it's unlikely they were being used, or it's possible, but unlikely. I think I wrote for Bellingcat. Right now, I would be a bit less certain of that assessment in light of developments, but like we never know. But it also goes to show the difficulty on tracking military drone use, particularly in areas where there's limited presence of journalists or people having access to the internet that can document these kind of things and share this with the wider world for like identification of drones and drone materials. And on the right side, you see an Iranian drone which we spotted on an airbase in Samara airport in Ethiopia, which was shipped to the government, also again used in the fight against Tigray armed forces. Recently on Sudan, again, there were rumors of Turkish TB3 drones being used. We didn't find any evidence so far until a report came out from the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, and a week later we happened to get our hands on an actual satellite image showing the TB2 drone there. So the Washington Post had an article where they had access to imagery of TB2 heads-up displays showing airstrikes and sort of a more WhatsApp or app messages between different actors proving Turkey was delivering drones. And here we could confirm it with this satellite image, and we have another satellite image showing the TBT drone in the Port Sudan actually earlier, because the Washington Post alleged that the drones were arriving in August in Sudan and being used from September, October, but we have now also footage showing a drone in Port of Sudan in June 2024, so they arrived there earlier, allegedly coming from or likely coming from top of my head, but I could be wrong. I think it was Burkina Faso or Mali where they were shipped from to, according to the Washington Post article. So yeah, and so apart from, and we've also seen Iranian drones being used by the SAF in Sudan. We've seen Chinese drones being exported to the RSF, and we've seen Wing Long-2s operating from an airbase on the border with Sudan in Chad, who are allegedly being used in support of the RSF, and there's a range of like long-range, one-way explosive drones being used by the RSF to target facilities. And here's an example of one of those. We've seen also active use of drones against critical infrastructure on numerous occasions. And then one example, this one, another one, like taking out these kind of electricity networks have a big impact on access to clean water, having an impact on civilians as well because of the increasing temperatures and lack of access to water, which is really significantly impacting the humanitarian situation. So that's sort of the bridge to the commercial drones and the explosive drones is because in particular these are the type of drones which are difficult to regulate under existing arms control agreements. So the larger armed drones are part of reporting mechanisms, and I'll show you an overview later of under the UN Registry of Conventional Weapons under the ATT for those states who signed up to the ATT, which Turkey did sign but didn't ratify it. China did also sign it. The US pulled out, but those kind of states have to report or do a risk assessment if they export drones, if these drones cannot be misused for human rights violations, war crimes, and a range of other conditions. But we can see those kind of states are not really taking into account those kind of risks because of the regimes they are exporting them to, and the actual use of them for targeting civilians in numerous occasions, as well documented by Drone Watch UK. So those technically should be controlled by that, and there should be a way of engaging states on the decisions they've made on a case-by-case basis and by states. But what has been changing in warfare at the moment is, on one side, the use of commercial explosive drones now being used, and I'm not exaggerating, in the millions. So Ukraine alone in 2024 produced 1 million explosive FPV drones. At the same time, Russia as well. We don't have the numbers from Russia, but there's likely more than the Ukraine has been producing, which are basically flying hand grenades or flying, depending on the payload, but they have been really changing the battlefield. But those are drones that are really difficult to control on the arms control regimes, because it's basically the carrying capacity of the drone that's is not regulated because it's a commercial platform, a small one, and it's the weapon underneath that makes it makes it into a flying bomb. So and what is a big demand of having access to this technology. And on the right side, you see the sort of one-way explosive drones, in this case, the Shahed, which Iran has been exporting to its proxy groups and to Russia, which have been used to targeting in Ukraine by Russia to target civilian infrastructure, power plants, but also by the Houthis have been using them widely. Iraqi militias have been using them to strike, carrying out strikes against US bases and trying to attempt to reach Israel with this kind of drones. And Iran themselves have been used in a large scale in Israel. And the issue with those kind of drones from a control perspective is that it's most of the systems are based on commercial components, which they import online or acquire in large volumes, and assemble them with other type of materials to construct the body of the plane, and then add like processors for GPS guidance. So as a plane itself, it's if you would export that, it would be a weapon. But if you let it bring the parts and components together at some point in support of a group, and you have the blueprints and you assemble it on site, then it's difficult to control these kind of one-way suicide drones. And we've also seen recently UAE exporting them a lot to RSF, and the RSF using them, as I showed in the previous example. So when it comes to control, like what do we have at the moment, the existing control regime? So we have the Wassenaar arrangement, which deals with like dual-use materials, but also civilian materials and munitions. Again, this is a small group of states, over 40 states, and it's based mostly on a voluntary basis. There's the Missile Technology Control Regime, which has references to unmanned systems, basically to prevent it from using weapons of mass destruction as a payload, but still it's a way to control export or provide an assumption of denial for those states who want to export them and are signed up to the Missile Technology Control Regime. But again, a small regime, I think just over 30 states signed up and not willing to expand to beyond that. There's the ITAR. It's from the US side, but again, limited. The Arms Trade Treaty, which also deals with combat aircraft and combat helicopters, which according to the definition refers to the UN Convention, UN Registry of Conventional Weapons, and it classifies there also uncrewed systems as part of aircraft or combat helicopters, but those are just reporting mechanisms to the UN in terms of they've exported. It can be helpful though, so we try to use that to monitor what has been exported. And then from the EU side, there's the UN Common Position that has a strict regulation for the EU to export on their export lists. So those are sort of official things in place, whereas the Arms Trade Treaty is the most helpful one. But again, as I mentioned, Turkey and signed up to it, and China as well. But not really addressing that with them. So what's new lately? 2016, the US tried to set up a joint declaration with 45 states signing up to it. That works towards developing in 2017, bringing together a core group of states on international standards on uncrewed armed vehicles. But that process didn't go anywhere afterwards as Trump took over in 2016. In the 4 years he was in place, when Biden won the elections, still there wasn't much movement. There was some discussions we were involved in, but it sort of died a slow death in the last couple of years. And then in 2024 in Portugal tried to re-kick the process. They got a group of states together, put out a statement with the ambition to develop a draft resolution on improving transparency, oversight, accountability in the acquisition, transfer, and use of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles. It's a mouthful. But they decided last minute in October 2024 not to move ahead with this resolution in the UN General Assembly's first committee. too much disappointed of those states and also NGOs who were involved in developing that resolution. Concerns were back then that they wouldn't get enough support and then it would fail to have like an impact. And it doesn't seem like with the new Trump administration coming in that they will try to restart this process in 2025, also not expecting getting support. So where does it leave us at the moment? Sorry for painting the bleak picture, and I'll round up after this, but like I think the continuous work to monitor the use, the civilian casualties, the risks of proliferation is more than needed. And that's why the work by Drone Wars UK and others, academics and NGOs, will continue to support that, because we have to continue to raise awareness on the impacts, and in particular what became clear from the research from Olatunji in it's like if it's out of sight, out of mind when it comes to civilian casualties, in particular in areas where there are hardly any groups or journalists doing reporting on the ground, and we see more tendency for militaries to acquire these kind of weapons because limited risk to their own side, and still you can strike anywhere. But we also see like the massive lack of training of qualified personnel in doing the image analysis on strikes that are carried out. So that explains the high civilian casualty load we've seen in those areas, and it's very difficult to verify claims being made because of lack of access. So I think we have to really continue to push forward and engage with states and to put pressure to prevent any further export of weapons to this kind of areas where we know there's irresponsible use and civilian casualties that are continue to witness every day. We're tracking these kind of conflicts. So that's sort of a state of play when it comes to proliferation. And I'll stop here and looking forward to any questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wim. Slightly, well, more than slightly depressing, but thank you so much for your presentation and for all the work you've done over so many years on this. So we've now got several questions and points. I got about a quarter of an hour or so left, but I don't know. Christy, did you want to come in and ask your question about the? If Christy wants to unmute.
Hi, yeah, am I audible?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it would be great to hear more from Cora and anyone else who's talking about the cost of the drones and the lower cost of the TB2s compared to Western models. So it would just be great to know what is the trade-off there for the buyers, and what are the implications of that? Does it make them any less reliable than Western models? Are they less capable of minimizing civilian casualties? What's the trade-off there? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think probably Wim and maybe Chris will be able to speak to this a little bit more just from the technical side. I mean, my impression, at least in the research that I've done, is that Western powers keep their cards quite close to their chests when it comes to drone exports. And actually drone exports from the West are very limited. So most of these countries will not have had the option to buy a drone from, say, the US. The US exports to a very limited number of countries. I think it's France, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, possibly. And the UK, and those are kind of the Western powers that have US drones. So, really, these vehicles like the Bayraktars, they come onto the scene as certainly among the early options, but also, as we say, much cheaper. In terms of their reliability, there have been noted crashes of Bayraktars. And lots of them seem to have come out of service quite quickly. So the kind of large numbers that were at play in the early stages of the war in Ukraine, lots of those are now already out of service. I might pass to Wim for some more specifics on that, because I think you might know a little more. But so there is a trade-off in the sense that that some of these vehicles seem to be of a kind of, I guess, lower quality, but also, in terms of the cheapness, these states are just able to assemble these quite impressive and large fleets of drones for not very much money. I think actually Nigeria is now, I can't remember the exact figure, but I think even just this kind of past winter, they've come into, many, many more. I think their fleet's in the hundreds now. Anyway, I'll pass on, or we can move on.
Do you have anything else to add to that, Vim, or is that?
Yeah, no, but what Cora mentioned, I think the US type of drones come also with a bigger infrastructure, because like you need to use like the satellite relay system, which is quite expensive for transferring data. So that drives up the cost as well. And indeed, the US is afraid for reverse engineering of their technology, so they keep it. They mostly share with NATO allies. Although Trump now allegedly is going to sell drones to a lot of drones to India. So that's sort of why why we don't see so much from the US when it comes to exports. But we do know that the US industry is not happy with that, because they feel like they're losing their market, the role in the market, and they feel they want to export more. And they see, of course, grinding their teeth, seeing China and Turkey take over that role of the market. But it sort of also explains. But in terms of like reliability, the US drones have, the China. I know because several countries were really not happy with Chinese drones quality. They've been crashing a lot, in particular in Iraq, Jordan. The CH4 and CH3 have been notoriously unreliable. Something that has Turkey tried to is doing it better at least. The range of the TB2s are really more limited compared with I think it have 200 or 300 kilometer range, whereas the satellite navigation from the M9s are thousands of kilometers. So that's also make a difference. But most countries we're using right now don't need thousands of kilometers. So for the states that have been documented in the report, I think these couple of 100 kilometers are usually fine.
Thank you very much for that. Chris, you had a question particularly for Olatunji about the reaction in Nigeria. Do you want to put it?
Sorry,
Chris?
yes, hello. Yeah, I was just wondering what the reaction, Olatunji, in Nigeria was to the strikes. Was there kind of outrage to the deaths? Was there kind of investigation, promise to kind of learn lessons, etc., etc., or was it kind of mainly kind of ignored or covered up? It'd be kind of interesting to hear a little bit about that.
I think one of the things that was different, and so I think inflation is really dark here. Sorry, one of the things I just turned off my video. One of the things that we've seen following the attack in Tudunbiri was, of course, like it was a high-profile incident. It was a lot of casualties. We had like a lot of press coverage. So the government was really forced to act. And I think 2 people were court-martialed over sort of the mistake that happened over the incident, just 2 people. But, I feel like those were scapegoats because, if lessons were actually learned, we would not have incidents barely a year later. So you see sort of 2 people were court-martialed. Of course, like the community was rewarded in court, which they built a hospital there because this is a really local community, and it's a weird thing because the community would not have basic amenities like water, like a school, if the attack had not happened, if they were not like victims of a botched strike. So of course, like over the next 1 year, the government tried to like compensate the community by building a clinic and a couple of other things. But in terms of learning lessons, I don't think any of that happened. 2 people were court-martialed again. 2 officers were court-martialed as a result of the process of an investigation into the incident. But after that, I mean, we still had another strike earlier this year, and we've not had anything. There's been no investigation into it, and then there was another one last year. There was no investigation into it because these were not necessarily high-profile stakes as we had last year. So I'd say like, yeah, I mean, in that case, they were very forced to act, to at least look like they were doing something. But in terms of the long-term lessons learned from that, nope, we've not had any of that.
Thank you very much. Okay, Cabana Hughes, I've got a couple of questions for you. Do you want to put those both? Or they're kind of question statements. Do you want to speak?
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, thank you very much. So my first question, I mean, it's a difficult one because I think that the use of drones is totally unacceptable, but it has to be asked. And so I'm thinking in particular the Sahel and Burkina Faso is on your list of countries which are high in the use of drones. And my question is, how do you persuade someone like Traore to desist from using drones when we know that the Sahel is a real global hotspot for terrorism? And he's probably going to riposte by saying he has no alternative because the insurgents that he's going out to attack are killing his populace and undermining his country. And I just wonder how you engage with that debate with somebody who we need to persuade to stop doing what he's doing. Thank you.
Who wants to take that? Cora?
Happy to speak to it a little bit. Fundamentally, I'm not a diplomat, and I don't think I do very, very well in those sorts of negotiations. But I think, you're right that these contexts that we've covered in the report are very different and need to be approached differently. I think broadly, I would say that if the last however many decades of foreign policy have taught us anything, it's that bombing people more tends not to fix the problem of radicalization, and that generally terrorist violence needs perhaps more complex responses than brute force. I mean, you sort of say that he's going out to attack these insurgents, and it may well be that those are his intentions, right? I don't know, but at least from what we've demonstrated in this report, the sheer scale of civilian casualties in Burkina Faso is such that it has looked like over and over again it's been active civilian targeting. We're talking about frequent bombings on marketplaces where families are present with children, for example. So I think I'm perhaps struggling to answer because I'm struggling to see the kind of strategic deliberacy of targeting insurgents in the approach that's actually been taken in Burkina Faso, but I'm also not a kind of country expert, so I perhaps can't speak to those intricacies as well as would merit a good response to your question.
Thank you. Anything to add?
If I would just add like a little bit, I mean, so we have like the same situation down here, where again, so for context, shouldn't be, like from the place where the bot strike happens, like you wouldn't drive 20 more minutes before you find like a real militant hideout, right? So there's that complication in terms of who is friend and who is foe. But I think in those cases, like no one, and I think like one of the, I mean, the voice of reason is that they sort of need the drones. But again, there is no effort at all to make sure that that use is ethical or sustainable. Because in knowing, I mean, if you had the power to do that, if you have the power to kill a whole community, then you have a responsibility to go to the community and actually find out and actually do. And in a lot of cases, in the case which is going to be a lot of cases where the drone is not usable, then do not use it. And if you use it, the international community has a responsibility to make sure that you don't have the means to use it. Like, I feel like it's not complex. Yeah, they're bad actors. Yeah, you need to defend yourself. But there are more sustainable ways to do this. And if you understand that, I mean, like the whole point of the law is that, it's better that a guilty man, of course, like we says, like, it's better a guilty man goes free than, an innocent man pay for crimes he did not commit. Like, you owe a responsibility if you know that people are going to die if you use this thing wrongly, to make sure that it's not used wrongly. It's very simple. And I don't think it's a very complicated, like we like to, diplomatize this. It's like, I don't think it's very complicated. We're talking about people's lives. So like, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Eileen, or Eileen, I don't know how you pronounce your name. You've got a question here about legal claims. Do you want to ask it? Oh, she's not enough.
I think she can't.
Oh, yeah, I just realised
Yeah.
that. So the question was, do you have information on the experience so far concerning attacks being recognised as faulty and mistargeted and possible legal claims for those affected? Anything about possible legal involvement?
I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead. I think Wim's just come on.
Yeah, no, there are still, there have been great examples where, no top of my head, but in Yemen, there have been this work done by lawyers trying to raise this, and there have been, I think, one compensation case, but the family rejected it because the US wanted to provide compensation, but the family who was from the lawyer wanted to have, it was not about the money, but they want to have it recognized, and they want to take the US take responsibility for the strike, but the US refused, so basically trying to buy off their responsibility. But in overall, it's been very difficult to get this kind of responsibility and legal cases to be successful, particular in areas where, like the Waziristan and Pakistan, which are prone to a lot of political changes or coups, in particular in Yemen as well, like the Yemeni government, like who is exactly the Yemeni government at the moment, which makes it more difficult to do court cases. And when it comes to the US, they're really tight-lipped about the data they were willing to share. So there was a push to be more transparent about it, and but most of those kind of policies have been, I think the word's rewinded or recalled under the Trump administration since he got into power. When it comes to preventing civilian casualties and a strike, there have been more responsibility given to lower commanders who can make their own decisions and loosen up the rules of or HL interpretations to be able to strike. So the US would just still continue to justify it, so that they create a legal rationale for continuing this kind of work by expanding sorry, it's been a long day and it is late here already, but I can't find a word for it. But yeah, but in the short answer is it's not very hopeful we're looking at in terms of getting compensation and recognition for these kind of when it comes to legal cases. But I think in countries where they're still functioning legal justice system. So there have been some cases, for example, with the Netherlands. It's not a drone strike, but when the Netherlands bombed a munition depot that caused a big explosion in Hawija. Now the Dutch government has apologized for this mistake they made and provided money to the communities, although that didn't end up in the right hands. But still, that's a case where this should be done when mistakes are being made, and could be a way forward to try to use this also in other cases. But yeah, so far from my side.
Thank you very much. I see we're now a couple of minutes over time, so I think we'll move to wrap up. I see Chris Cole has put in to the chat to say that we're seeing a real increase in proliferation of armed drones at the same time as we're seeing a real decline in international community interest in proliferation control. So it's time for all of us to redouble our efforts. I think he's completely right there. And just before thanking all three of our panelists, I think we also need to thank the Passionistas of St. Patrick of Ireland and Britain, who provided the money to have the report written and printed, and also to our ongoing funders, such as the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust and the Network for Social Change, among others. So thanks to them. And thanks to our three panelists, Cora, Wim and Olatunji. Thanks so much for everybody who's come along tonight, and do keep up to date with what Drone Wars has been doing. Thank you.
Thanks
and
so much.
by the way, if you need to find the report, it is linked from the Drone Wars website. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Anne.